Muscle car wars were all about bigger is better, and biggest is best. But over half of the Saturday night cruising was done under small block power. Here it is, the big playground. This is where the muscle car games were played. This is where reputations were made and cars became legends. Out here, performance talked and everything else walked. During the muscle years, Detroit's car makers were going all out to make next year's cars faster than this year's. And in the pre-emissions, cheap gas world of the 60s, most of the time they got that done by simply stuffing in a bigger engine.
You gotta love the big blocks. The big blocks have the thump and the thunder, and it's so easy to make a cloud of smoke with the big block engine. It makes anybody look good. You're an instant boulevard hero with the big block engine.
But mixed in with all those big-inch ground pounders was a slew of high-winding, super-performing little engines that on any day of the week could put many of those mountain motors on the trailer. Even though the big block cars were the ones you saw on all the magazine covers, it's a fact that about 70% of the cars we all cruised in and took down the quarter mile were powered by engines no larger than 350 cubic inches. Anyone who was there during the glory years knows that it was those short-stroke screamers, like the 327s, 340s, and 289s, that did most of the heavy hauling.
Small blocks were affordable, small blocks were drivable, small blocks were more practical to live with, and when it came right down to it, a lot of guys were opting for the small block over the big block.
Most people didn't buy small block muscle cars for their luxury or power options. Most people bought small block cars because they were affordable. Cars like the Z28 Camaro, the K-Code Mustang, and the 346 Pack Cuda were lighter, quicker, and could pull revs out the yin-yang. And in a very nice side benefit, the smaller engine cars didn't send any warning signals to your insurance carrier.
Insurance was a killer. If you were able to scrape enough money together to go into the showroom and buy your first muscle car, you were in for a rude awakening when you sat down with your insurance man, because it was not uncommon for your insurance premiums to equal or exceed the amount that you were paying on your car payments.
So here's our tribute to the cars most of us own, the small block screamers. We'll get this thing rolling when we come back on the American Muscle Car. Make no mistake, General Motors is huge. So big, in fact, that during the muscle car years, each division, Cadillac, Pontiac, Buick, Olds, and Chevrolet, each had their own engine designs. Some of the GM divisions, Chevrolet in particular, had 2 or 3 different sized block castings, which led to the small block and big block designations. Pontiac, however, was not so blessed. Pontiac's first modern V8 was created in 1955. It weighed in at 287 cubic inches. And for the next 22 years, all Pontiac V8s used the same basic block casting. Through the years, Pontiac bored and stroked this same basic block to make 11 different engines, from 278 to 455 cubic inches.
The classic big block and small block terms did not apply to Pontiac. Pontiac had a one-size-fits-all block, and they were able to adjust the displacement up and down using just the one block. So they could stretch it from the small engines of the 50s up through 326, 389, and then into the 455s.
By now, everyone knew how potent Pontiac's big engines were. But coming in under most people's radar was a smaller Pontiac engine that could really make some power. Pontiac called it the 350 HO. This engine used the 400's crankshaft, a 3.876-inch bore, and the 10.5 compression Ram Air 3 cylinder heads. The HO also used a lighter, stronger valve train, the high output oil pump from the 400, and a Rochester Quadrajet 4-barrel carb. This was basically a little Ram Air 3 engine, and it cranked out 330 horsepower at 5,500 RPM. Without the GTO's heavy Endura front bumper and its posh interior, the 350HO was a low 14-second performer in both the Le Mans and the Firebird, at 3/4 the cost of a GTO.
350HO, in my estimation, is one of the unsung heroes of the small block engine families.
In 1964, Olds was the only car maker besides Pontiac to offer the world a genuine muscle car, the 442. Like the name implied, it came with a 4-speed transmission, 4-barrel carburetor, and dual exhausts. The 64 442 was built around a nice little 330 cubic inch power plant. But by 1965, Olds felt the need to run with the big dogs, so they built a new 400 cubic inch engine for the 442. And those extra 70 cubes made a big difference.
442 was one of the original muscle cars, and it was a total package. It had the style, it had the substance, it had the marketing sizzle, and on the street it really delivered the full punch.
But as nice as the big motor 442 was, the designers at Olds never forgot how much fun it was to beat up on bigger cars with a smaller engine. So in 1968, they created one of the muscle era's most potent little cars, the Ramrod.
It's based off a small block number 1, which is a very short stroke engine and all that. It's only a 3.37 inch stroke, so it's very high revving. It does have a big bore and all that. It's 457, and also it's very much over square, and they just love to rev high.
The 350 cubic inch Ramrod was a true masterpiece. Called the W31 option, it was carefully assembled from hand-selected parts. Each motor was a blueprinted high-performance piece, right from the factory.
What they did was a select fit on all the parts. So basically there was a standing order out from the engineering department that said, if you ever get a dead nuts perfect part, we want it. The W31 option and all only ran for 3 years, 68, 69, and 70 and all, and they canceled it in 1971 when the high compression went away.
Olds only turned out 500 of these little jewels in 1968, so you're excused if you've never seen a Ramrod before. If you've ever come up against one, though, you'd probably remember it, at least from this angle.
Currently, it runs about 13.8, 13.9 seconds and a quarter mile at about 98, 99 miles an hour. It has run a 13.30 at 105.
The Olds and Pontiac 350s were proof that you didn't need a mega-inch engine to be a terror on the street and the strip. A good running small block would get the job done any day.
I've been matched against 446 packs, and 429 Torinos, a couple of Olds 455s which we beat, which that was kind of fun, and also, but it's not faster, but it's quicker.
We'll be right back for more small block fun and games when the American muscle car returns. Little miracle motors like the Olds W31 come along once in a generation, but some engines span several generations. And when it comes to spanning generations, Ford Motor Company has no equal. Since the late 50s, among the big three, Ford had been the go big or stay home engine builder. The 352, the 390, and the mighty 427 were icons of big Detroit iron. But in 1962, Ford introduced a lightweight, thin-wall V8 that would become one of the world's favorite high-performance power plants.
The engine was started as a 221 cubic inch V8, had a very small bore, very small stroke, and that happened to be the exact cubic inch displacement of the first Ford V8, which was the flathead in 32. And the engine was designed and developed for the Fairlane. It was the smallest domestic V8 even to today. It's one of the very smallest dimensionally, length and width, and even the weight. It was first in the Fairlanes, and then it progressed to the Falcons, and then finally to the Mustang.
By 1965, this little engine had grown to 289 cubic inches, and Ford had poured enough go-fast into it to make it a serious rev monster. With a huge bore of 4 inches and a short 2.87-inch stroke, the 289 took the engineering term over-square to the max. It didn't make terrific torque, but the hypo version of this engine, called the K-Code 289, would pull to 6,000 RPM in a heartbeat, if you'll pardon that expression. The Keiko 289 made 271 horsepower with a 450 lift solid camshaft, a cast iron intake manifold, and a tiny 480 CFM Holley 4-barrel carburetor. Thanks to its small size and its light weight, just 450 pounds, some big-time racers, from Colin Chapman to Dan Gurney to Carroll Shelby, found numerous uses for this engine. Ford's little V8 powered Jimmy Clark's Indianapolis 500 winning Lotus. 289 powered Mustangs and Cobras went on to own sports car and Trans Am racing. And this engine eventually morphed into the world-beating Boss 302.
It's funny, it doesn't get any respect, but it's the only American V8 to win the world, the world championship in FIA, sports car racing. Now, it didn't win NASCAR titles or drag racing titles per se, but the engine had a real good longevity to it. The design was so, not nearly perfect, but it was so robust that it could survive, and it survived from the early 60s up until just a few years ago.
Despite all the big block action on the street, small block lovers had one play yard that was reserved exclusively for them, Trans Am racing. And everybody had a dog in that hunt. We'll take the little engines out to the track when the American muscle car returns. One of the muscle car year's most exciting racing series never saw engines larger than 305 cubic inches. Of course, we're talking about Trans Am racing. Trans Am was a playground for some of the world's best drivers. Pushing Detroit iron around America's best road courses was a treat for world-class talent like Dan Gurney and Mark Donohue. And spectators soon became addicted to both the series and the cars. Needless to say, this did not go unnoticed in Detroit.
The factory Trans Am wars were really heating up on and off the track. By 70, Mopar was coming into the picture with its new Cuda and another dodgy body called the Challenger.
But Trans Am racing had a 5-liter limit on engine size. For Dodge and Plymouth, this was not a problem. They just left the big dogs on the porch and went hunting with their smallest engine, the 340. The 340 was the raciest member of Chrysler's LA engine family, which hit the streets in 1964 as a 180 horsepower, 273 cubic inch V8. But by 1966, the Commando 273 had beefed up to 275 horsepower, thanks to Chrysler's hot rod engineers.
273 is one of the greatest small blocks I think has ever made. It's very underrated, but if you look at the horsepower per cubic inch, it was a great engine. Carter AFB 4-barrel carburetor, solid lifter camshaft, and we had a limited production, very rare car called the old D Dart, which came out in the mid-60s, which is a special package for a customer to go right into NHRA stock eliminator racing.
By 1968, Mopar's small block now weighed in at 340 cubic inches, and it was one of the best designed little V8s anywhere.
340 is probably the most famous small block Chrysler ever made, and probably one of the best small blocks within the industry. Introduced in 1968, it's rated 275 horsepower, 10.5 to 1 compression ratio. When that engine was in a Barracuda Formula S or a Dodge Dart GTS or Swinger, it was a giant killer. These cars could drop a 396 Chevelle, no problem.
With a bore of 4.04 inches and a stroke of 3.31, the 340 used a Ford steel crank and flat-top pistons to make 10.75 to 1 compression. A 430 lift cam and a Carter ABS 4-barrel carb helped this engine crank out 275 rated horsepower. The whole thing weighed just 539 pounds, and it fit nicely between the fenders of the Dart, the Cuda and Challenger, and the Demons and Dusters of the 70s. But where the 340 really made its reputation was right here, in Chrysler's Trans Am cars. This is the 340 six-pack, and it was a special version of this little motor made for going racing. Mopar's racing 340s were slimmed down to 303.8 cubic inches by world-famous engine builder Keith Black, and they all used a special stronger block new heads with larger ports, Hemi valve train parts, and a few other goodies. In Dan Gurney's and Swede Savage's race cars, these engines made nearly 460 horsepower. The cool part of all this was, for the slightly more than 5,000 people who bought an AAR Cuda or a Challenger TA in 1970, you got the same high-strength block and the good heads, along with a very trick 3-Holly carb induction system. Nice deal, huh?
In 1970, Chrysler Corporation wanted to get into the Trans Am series, so they came out with the limited production AAR Cudas and TA Challengers. The Chrysler engineers thought, let's do a 346-pack as an image builder. And they got what they LeBrock, and they had the 346-pack rated 290 horsepower. Again, it was another great motor. Unfortunately, it was only available for 1 year, but the parts are still available to make your own 346-pack today.
If you cruised with a Mopar 340 under your hood, or a 289, or a Ramrod 350, you knew that your little dog could run with the big dogs. But you had to choose who you ran with pretty carefully. Sometimes the toughest competition came from other small blocks. Stand by for some very tough competition when the American muscle car returns. The muscle car era was as much about the engines as it was about the cars. And to most enthusiasts, car companies have forever become identified with their best motors. When you think of Ford, you think of the big side-oiler 427s. When you think of Mopar, you think of the Hemi. And when you think of Chevrolet, you naturally think of this engine, the Chevy small block. The Chevrolet small block isn't just a famous engine, it's more than that. The small block defined Chevrolet for an entire generation.
It's just about impossible to overstate the significance of the Chevy small block. It really transformed not just Chevrolet Motor Division, but the whole industry, the whole muscle car scene for decades.
When it was introduced in 1955, this engine displays 265 cubic inches. And almost immediately, everyone from corporate engineers to backyard hot rodders started making it bigger. This motor single-handedly saved the Corvette from 6-cylinder extinction. It created true street machines out of 4-door sedans. And in the trick of the decade, it did something nobody thought possible. It transformed dowdy, boring old Chevrolets into muscle cars.
It was really basically a combination of the two that combined performance with somewhat, if you like to call, high-performance reliability. The valves wouldn't float in it, and that was the purpose of that, to keep it, to give it higher upper RPM horsepower.
Through the years, the small block's growth curve has been nearly vertical, from 265 cubic inches in 1955 to 283 in 1957, to 327 in 1962, to 350 in 1970, to its ultimate displacement of 400 cubic inches in 1973. Chevrolet astonished the world by how much they could bore and stroke this motor. But when it came to the small block, size really didn't matter. Some of the raciest small blocks were tiny little engines.
There was the Fuelie 327s in the early Corvettes. There was L79, showed up in the Nova and in a handful of Chevelles. The LT1s came along in 70, 71, very hot solid lifter 350. L82 was the top engine during the smog years.
Thanks to the small block's size, weight, and phenomenal output, Chevy created some incredible cars around this motor, and most of those cars have become legends. Maybe the most awesome small block ever made was the 302 cubic inch engine that powered the Z28 Camaros to back-to-back championships in Trans Am racing. The 302 came out of Chevy's engine shop rated at 290 horsepower. But by the time it rolled off the starting grid in one of Roger Penske's Camaros, it was making 475 horsepower with practically no changes. This truly was the little engine that could.
One of the most important characteristics of a great design is its lifespan. Most engines stay in production for around 10 years, give or take a little bit. The Chevy small block has been in production for 50 years now. That's unheard of. There's no other engine that can make that claim.
Finally, after nearly 50 years of making this miracle motor, Chevrolet dedicated 10 years and $100 million to top what they had. This is the LS1, Chevy's small block for the next 50 years.
Basically, when they started with this motor, it was really not talked about at all, and they had a few things they had to knock out. They had to make a motor lightweight, and this motor here is so heavy that it just wasn't going to get the job done. So they had to change to aluminum alloy, basically with aluminum heads and aluminum block, to actually drop the weight out of the motor to start with. They also had to make a motor that made 1 horsepower and 1 foot-pound for every cubic inch. They did all this, and they also maintained the strict emissions requirements of the EPA.
Similar in physical size and layout, the new engine is light years ahead of the traditional small block in every area, from port design to the material used to make it. The block and heads are aluminum alloy, the rods are powdered metal, the crank is forged steel, and the whole package weighs about 300 pounds less than the cast iron motor. But it still maintains an important small block characteristic. It makes massive power. These days, when a big engine is a 3.8-liter V6, it's difficult to remember when a 350-cube V8 was little. But to many a big block driver, those little engines were terror weapons, and their owners lived to do the job on a big-inch muscle car. For the small block screamers, it was a big poker game. You had to know when to hold them and when to fold them. When you forked over less than $3,000 for a small block car and went out and smoked a $4,000 big block car, well, there just wasn't anything better. Thanks for watching the American Muscle Car. And please remember, don't crush them, restore them.